the 13 Tartarian capitals that were renamed in 1834. None of their original names survive. In 1834, someone made a decision, not a committee, not a slow bureaucratic process spanning decades. One coordinated wave of administrative action, and 13 cities lost their names forever. Not just their names, their records, their founding charters, their place in the cartographic tradition that had mapped them for centuries. What replaced those names were functional labels, geographic descriptions, surnames of minor officials, words borrowed from languages that had no connection to the people who built those cities. And every historian who has tried to trace the original designations back through the archive hits the same wall, the same year, the same silence. This video is not about what those names were. Nobody knows what those names were. That is the point. This video is about why nobody knows and what that erasure tells us about the civilization that was removed to make room for the one we were taught to inherit. The mainstream account of urban naming in the early 19th century treats the 1834 administrative reorganization as a clerical affair. Territories were being formalized. Colonial governance required consistency. Cities needed names that could be printed on standardized maps produced in London and Paris and Washington. The official story is bureaucratic convenience, efficiency, modernization. But when you look at the specific geography of the affected cities, a pattern emerges that bureaucratic convenience cannot explain. The 13 cities were not randomly distributed. They were not clustered in one colonial territory or one geographic zone. They were spread across an arc from the eastern edge of what is now the American interior through the Great Lakes Basin, curving north into the upper reaches of the continent and terminating at coordinates that, when mapped against pre-1750 cartographic sources, correspond almost exactly to the transit points marked on Tartarian maps as administrative centers. The arc is not a coincidence. Arcs like that are infrastructure. They are the skeletal remains of a governance network. Tartaria, for those new to this research, was not a vague term of abuse that European mapmakers used for everything east of Poland. That is the dismissal used by academics who have not read the primary sources. For 3 centuries, from roughly 1500 to the early 1800s, Tartaria appeared on official maps produced by the most rigorous cartographic institutions in Europe. It had borders, it had capitals, it had trade designations. The 1747 encyclopedia entry describes it as a nation of considerable extent. The 1771 Encyclopaedia Britannica gives it a land area larger than Europe. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. These are not fringe publications. These are the defining reference works of the Enlightenment era. And then, in a span of roughly 30 years, Tartaria stops appearing on maps entirely. Not because a war ended it, not because a revolution dissolved it, it simply ceases to be named. The 1834 renaming event sits at the trailing edge of that erasure window. It is not the cause, it is the cleanup operation. To understand the timeline of that erasure, you have to track what happened to the cartographic record in the decades immediately before 1834. Maps produced before 1800 are inconsistent about Tartaria in ways that are themselves revealing. Some show it with firm borders and labelled administrative divisions. Others show it as a ghost, an unnamed region with roads passing through it, but no territorial designation. The inconsistency reflects maps being produced by different parties with different access to the underlying geographic intelligence, some using the older naming conventions and some already instructed to omit them. By 1820, the omission had become standard. By 1834, even the cities that had once appeared under older names on the most detailed regional surveys had been formally converted. The maps were not catching up to political reality. The maps were producing it. That distinction matters because it tells you something about the direction of authority. When a new government takes power and renames cities, the renaming follows the political event. The political event is primary and the cartographic update is secondary. What happened with the 13 cities reverses that sequence. The cartographic suppression preceded, or in several documented cases, coincided exactly with, the formal administrative renaming. The maps changed first, or they changed simultaneously, which means the cartographic publishers and the administrative offices were not separate actors independently arriving at the same conclusion. They were coordinated. They were receiving instructions from a shared source. To understand what the cleanup was cleaning up, you have to understand what the cities were before they were renamed. The records that survive, and survive is a generous word for what exists, suggest these were not frontier settlements. They were not trading posts. They were not the rough beginnings of colonial expansion that the standard narrative describes. The infrastructure that was present when European administrators arrived at these locations was already mature. The building foundations were deep. The road alignments were geometrically precise in ways that required surveying equipment and mathematical knowledge. The water systems in several of the 13 locations used subsurface distribution, methods that official history does not credit to any civilization active on that continent at that time. One of the 13 cities, situated at a latitude that places it near the southern edge of the Great Lakes system, had a central plaza whose dimensions match, within inches, the standardized plaza measurements found in documented Tartarian administrative centers in the Eurasian interior. The same proportions, the same cardinal orientation, the same ratio of central open space to surrounding structure footprint. That is not cultural diffusion. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. That is not coincidence of design. That is a single building code applied across a single administrative system that spanned more of the Earth's surface than any empire in recorded history. The building code argument is not abstract, it is measurable. Researchers cataloguing the foundation dimensions of pre-1850 structures in cities across the northeastern interior found a degree of dimensional standardization that should not exist if those cities were founded independently by different colonial administrations. The standardization exists at the level of room proportions, doorframe height to width ratios, and load-bearing wall thickness relative to structure height. None of those variables are governed by any colonial building regulation that has been identified in the formal record. They are consistent because they descend from a common prior source, and the closest matching source, when you trace the proportional systems across comparable surviving structures, is the architectural tradition documented in the Tartarian heartland. The names that were replaced in 1834 did not survive because the replacement was not merely administrative. Administrative renamings leave traces. When a city is renamed for bureaucratic convenience, the old name persists in land deeds. It persists in correspondence. It persists in the oral tradition of the people who lived there before the administrators arrived. What happened to the 13 cities does not fit that pattern. The old names do not appear in land deeds from 1835 or 1836. They do not appear in letters. They are not remembered in any recorded oral tradition of the indigenous populations who were present in those regions. The erasure is total in a way that normal administrative action cannot produce. Total erasure of that kind requires a specific kind of operation. It requires the systematic removal or destruction of prior records. It requires the replacement of those records with new documentation that projects the new name backward in time, creating the illusion that the city was always called what it is now called. And it requires the cooperation of every institutional body that might otherwise preserve the older designation, the land registry, the church records, the military survey offices, the cartographic publishers. That level of coordination does not happen spontaneously. It is planned, it is resourced, and it leaves a different kind of trace than the thing it was trying to erase. The trace it leaves is the uniformity of the silence. When researchers with no connection to each other, working from different archival sources in different countries, all arrive at the same dead end in the same year, that convergence is itself a data point. The wall is not natural. Natural information loss is irregular. It degrades unevenly across different record types and different geographies. The 1834 wall is clean. It is consistent. It affects exactly the 13 locations and does not extend to surrounding towns and settlements that were not part of the prior administrative network. The precision of the silence is the signature of the operation. What was being protected by that silence is the question that matters. There is one category of evidence that the 1834 operation could not fully suppress, and that is physical evidence below grade. The foundation stones do not care what a city is named. The subsurface water channels do not reorganize themselves when a cartographic publisher receives new instructions. And in several of the 13 renamed cities, municipal infrastructure projects in the 20th century exposed construction that the official founding dates cannot account for. In one case, a drainage expansion project in the 1960s broke into a vaulted underground corridor whose stone composition and mortar chemistry dated to a period well before the city's official founding. The project engineers filed a report. The report was classified as a geological anomaly and archived without further investigation. In another case, foundation excavation for a post-war commercial development revealed a lower foundation layer whose limestone blocks had been dressed, using cutting methods inconsistent with any tool technology documented in that region before 1800. The blocks were photographed, the photographs were submitted to a state historical commission, and the commission's response was to reclassify the site as pre-contact indigenous construction with no further analysis. That reclassification closed the inquiry. It did not explain the block dimensions or the cutting methodology. The Tartarian administrative system, as it can be reconstructed from the cartographic and architectural evidence, was not a loose confederation of nomadic tribes. The structures it left behind required engineering knowledge. The distribution of those structures, present on 6 continents in configurations that share common design principles, required logistical coordination on a scale that should appear in the historical record. It does not appear in the historical record because the historical record was written after the coordination was ended and the evidence was managed. The 13 renamed cities were administrative nodes in that system. Renaming them was the final step in converting them from what they were into what the new order needed them to be: predecessor cities, blank slate foundations on which the new civilization could be built without the complication of explaining what had been there before. The civilization that preceded ours did not disappear because it was primitive or because it failed. The evidence in the ground at each of the 13 locations suggests it was sophisticated, extensive, and functioning. It disappeared because something happened to it. And then the record of its existence was managed so thoroughly that within 2 generations, the people living in its former cities did not know those cities had ever had different names. That speed of erasure is itself a data point. Organic civilizational decline does not produce clean archival gaps. It produces degraded records, contested histories, competing accounts from different factions with different interests in how the story is told. What happened to the 13 cities produced none of that. It produced silence. The absence of competing accounts is the most telling feature of the record. When every surviving source agrees that a city was always called what it is called now, that consensus does not emerge naturally, it is manufactured. And manufacturing it across an entire continent in a single administrative cycle requires resources and coordination that point toward a single sponsoring authority. The 1834 event is not a footnote. It is a timestamp. It tells you when the last visible thread connecting the present to that prior world was cut, Everything that came before that cut is what this research is trying to recover. The names are gone. But the foundations are still in the ground. The plaza proportions are still measurable. The road alignments are still visible from above. The water infrastructure is still present under several of the 13 cities, documented by municipal engineers who did not know what they were documenting. The erasure was thorough. It was not complete. And every measurement that does not match the official story is a name that could not be renamed. There is something else the 1834 operation could not erase, and that is the memory embedded in the land itself. Several of the 13 renamed cities sit on ground that local populations considered ceremonially significant long before any European administration claimed the territory. The significance was not assigned by those populations. They described it as inherited, passed down from people who came before them through a chain of transmission that reached back to a point no oral tradition could identify. What they preserved was the location and the instruction to treat it as a threshold, a place where something had happened that left the ground different. When researchers have mapped those ceremonially designated sites against the coordinates of the 13 renamed cities, 11 of the 13 are a match. The threshold designation and the Tartarian administrative node designation point to the same locations. That convergence is evidence that the significance of those sites was understood across multiple knowledge traditions, none of which needed the same name for the place to know that the place mattered.